Okay, so today's session, we're going to break into two parts with a little mini break in between. So we're going to look at self-explanatory style and grit. And in the middle, to sandwich it nicely, a team is going to jump in with a contemplative practice that we can use as well. So the first part of this is self-explanatory style. At Middleton, we talk a lot about resilience. It's actually one of our key values. It's embedded to our curriculum, but it's also embedded into the way that we try and do all of our practice. So our definition, our working definition of resilience is persevering, and we demonstrate resourcefulness when striving to meet our goals. We show buoyancy, confidence, and maintain perspective when faced with challenges and change. And this is something that we build into our curriculum. And we hope that your kids are experiencing some element of challenge, struggle, and perseverance in their learning, because that's a really important part of it as well. The other thing to note is that resilience is incredibly personal. It's based on lived experience. So Tim and I aren't coming in as world leaders on resilience, parenting. We're coming in as people who can basically have the privilege of stealing lots of research and bringing it together and sharing different perspectives on what we think is going to support families, including our own. So for the first thing is that resilience is lived experience based on how you grew up, based on your context, is going to inform how you parent and therefore how your children respond to you. So that while these techniques are useful, they're also very conceptual. So you can apply them, but how it's worked out will really differ depending on your own family, your context, how many kids you've got, who else is living, all sorts of different things. So we want to make that just a bit of a catch-all at the start, that we realize that resilience is an incredible personal journey. But one thing that we do have in common is our self-explanatory style. And this is simply put, basically, what do we say to ourselves when something goes wrong? The Japanese proverb says, fall down 7 times, get up 8. It's that idea that when you make a mistake, it's inevitable. When things don't go well, when you don't get the job that you want, when your child comes in 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 75th, it's not so much about the result, it's the response after it. It's how you pick yourself up. And so for one, as parents, we know this, sometimes our kids forget this, that they are going to make mistakes, whether they're adolescents and they're going into their teen years, whether they're K2, things don't go to plan. As adults, we know this. We've gone through many no's and setbacks and challenges in our life, and we've developed a way of explaining things to ourselves when they don't go well. But in saying that, there's a healthy way of explaining negative events and there's a non-healthy way. And so we're going to explain some of the things that we can do to support our children when things don't go well or when they don't become number one at everything. So to get your minds framed accurately, have a think about your last mistake. I'm not going to make you publish this on the chat, but just have a think about when was your last no, or maybe one that sticks out, when you didn't win the grand final, when the job didn't go your way, when you bidded for a property or you went for something and you just missed out. Bring it to your awareness and think about, how did you feel about that? And also importantly, what did you do afterwards? Was it enough for you to say, you know what, in grade 4 art, I got a lot of criticism, so I gave it up. And now I think I'm not artistic. Or did you change your self-explanatory style and respond in a different manner? And so I think it's important from a parenting perspective that obviously we acknowledge we've got our own biases and inherent ways of doing things based on the way that we grew up, based on the mistakes and mess ups that we made. And so what I'd like to share with you today is a couple of different research perspectives. So this is from Martin Seligman, Dan Pink, and Dan Siegel. So we've got a combination of psychologists, psychiatrists, researchers, journalists, all talking in very different ways about the same core elements. And this is the way that we explain events when things don't go wrong. And you might be thinking, this doesn't really matter, Matt. Come on, I just want a really quick and easy takeaway. This does matter. So Dan Siegel's response to that is that in the long run for our kids, it's not necessarily about what happened that affects us. So the first place or the third place in the long run doesn't really matter. It's our response, our language, and the next steps that matter. So if it is winning the race, that's great. Then it's also, how do we prepare for the next one that matters? Optimists are just as likely to encounter bad events as pessimists. Where they diverge is in their explanations. I think it's interesting too. It's not about just having these rose-colored glasses where we all think that wonderful things are going to happen all the time. Events are going to happen regardless, but how we explain them is really interesting. And Seligman, who is the founding father of positive psychology, talked about helplessness as a way of explaining negative events to ourselves was paramount. He suggested that people who gave up easily became helpless, even in situations when they could do something, explained events as permanent, pervasive, and personal. And they're the 3 Ps that we're going to draw on in a couple of minutes as a really simple takeaway to use in your life, whether things are explained as permanent, pervasive, and personal. Those people who explained events as permanent and pervasive turn minor complications into major catastrophes. And this is really visible in toddlers when they're building a tower and it crashes down and the world crashes down around them. It's a minor complication, but for them, it's a major catastrophe. It's pervasive, it's ruined the day. And so this is one aspect of self-explanatory style. And the idea is that we want to become buoyant in an ocean of rejection. And that sounds really negative. But the idea is that we get lots of no's and setbacks and challenges and feedback all the time. And so we need to be aware of that. So how do we raise kids that are floating above the surface, that don't get pulled under when something doesn't go their way? And one tool to have a look at this is the more broader perspective, and then we'll narrow it into a takeaway. So this is Martin Seligman's self-talk continuum. And he says that our internal dialogue says a lot about how we perceive events. So one challenge for us all as parents is to listen really carefully to one, how do we explain negative events, both positive and negative? And what is the language and the semantics that our children are using when things go well and when things go poorly? And so his idea is that there's a continuum, and it's either about us or others. It can be fixed or temporary. It can be global or one event. And in essence, we want to be on the far right of the continuum as much as possible. And I'll go through that in a sense, but the idea is that even when we win, we want to be able to say that we are part of a bigger story, that win was temporary and it was specific to one event, rather than being everything fixed in time, everything's about us and everything is global. So the difference between that first one, which is the personal, the first P, if our explanatory style is internal, it's all about us. We assume the successes or failure was because of our contributions. We made it happen or we failed. This is the basketballer who struts onto the court and they are the only member of the team. If they lose, they lost the game. If they won, it was because they made everything happen. So if our self-talk is external though, we become to be aware of others playing a part or others influencing the outcome. So if they are a fantastic basketballer, they walk off the court and say, you know what, I've got a great team, a great coach, some great parents around me. Yes, I won, but my goodness, there are other people building me up at the same time. The second P is pervasive. If everything becomes global, so huge, pervasive, a global perspective on self-talk infers that a problem or success is so large it pervades all aspects of life. A win can seem gigantic and a failure can seem unfathomable. A specific perspective on self-talk infers that the problem or success is targeted in one area of life. It doesn't define all areas. So you might have a child who's brilliant at maths, who thinks that they are brilliant at everything. And you actually know that you're really good at maths. This is one specific area. You still need to work hard on all these other areas as well. And the last one is permanent. Is it going to last forever? Is this failure going to ruin my life in 20 years' time? As parents, we know it probably won't. But for kids, sometimes they lose that sense that one no is no forever. And so stable versus unstable. Stable talk refers to the problem or event being permanent and fixed. It removes opportunities for growth and reflection. Unstable or temporary self-talk allows us to celebrate our wins and learn from our failures. A win today doesn't guarantee a win tomorrow. And so it's that really positive culture as if things are going well, great, mum and dad, I won first place. What can I do to keep getting better? And they enjoy the process. If things go wrong, they come last. We don't throw the towel and say, well, that's it. I'm never going to run anymore. I'm never going to take art class anymore because it's all over. Oops. So inherently as adults, when something goes wrong, we want to be able to justify where does the problem lie. Sometimes it might be, yes, it's about us, but we know it's temporary. It might be global because it's really big deal at the moment in our grade 4 child's life, but we know that it's not going to last forever. It's temporary. So that's the bigger picture and the research behind Seligman's self-explanatory style. The really, really easy take home for parents is the 3 Ps. So it's teaching our children and us when something goes wrong. For one, is it permanent? Is it going to last forever? Is it pervasive? Does it flow through all aspects and all domains of our life? And is it personal? Is it really just about you, or are there others involved as well? And so I encourage you to have a think about how those 3Ps can be used in your own meta language when something goes wrong for you, but also when something doesn't go well for our kids, to sit down and have a conversation with them to say, okay, is it pervasive, is it permanent, and is it personal? We'll share these slides out with you, but there's a link to an article that pulls together some of these different ideas and philosophies. I will put the disclaimer out, I wrote it, so forgive me, but I wanted to pull together some of the things from this workshop and share them with parents and other schools as well. So there's a bit more in depth there if you're interested in self-explanatory style and grit as well. Okay, that's the first part of our session. I'm going to hand over to Atima now, who's going to talk a little bit about contemplative practice before we look at the role that grit plays in raising our kids. Atima, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. I really enjoy listening to this, and it's really good because when there are two people who are interested in the same thing, and then we have a lot of our teachers and our well-being team coming together and discussing this, it is really easy for us to then filter and trickle this down to our children in bite-sized pieces. So for us, it is really important to ensure that we keep having these dialogues and we keep having these conversations, because the quality of the stories we tell ourselves determine the quality of the lives we lead. So I think that is something that is really important for us. What are the stories that we are telling ourselves? And it is not to say that we don't tell these stories are not realistic. But the point is, what do we do with these stories that we are talking and we are discussing with ourselves and with each other about ourselves? So this is a lot of information. And though it's given in a bite-sized chunk, there's a lot to internalize. So we're going to do a quick practice and see how can we use this practice to develop those neural pathways that Matt has just referred to. Last week, we discussed a couple of strategies to build and cultivate our resilience muscle. One of the things that we have to do is that when something comes our way, we talked about a tool called I Can, and we talked about a tool called Stop. When something comes our way, we need to identify what resources we have within ourselves. We need to look at what resources we have to support around us. We talk about cultivating strategies and practices. And this is one of the challenges that we have, that we don't give enough time to cultivation of practice. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about how do you cultivate a practice before you act and reflect, or before you say, okay, I'll never give up. So today we're going to have some fun, okay? Because if you don't play, you don't laugh enough, then that day is wasted. And we strongly believe in that for our children and for ourselves. And the other reason is that play actually brings out a lot of resilience, it brings out a lot of good hormones basically in you, right? So this is one part of it. The second part of it is that we look at our children, and sometimes asking them to sit and meditate can get boring. So how do you develop that contemplative practice with a little bit of fun, with a little bit of ease? So today we're going to share one practice with you, which we encourage you to try and have some fun with it. And then this is also something that you can do with your children, particularly when you're all cooped up in your house. So here we go. Get ready, because we're going to try out something fun, okay? One of the things is that when you are going for a difficult conversation, you're going for a difficult meeting, or when you get up in the morning and you see a whole big household that needs to be cleaned up, you need to muster up that sense of, okay, I can do this. So a very simple way of doing it is what is called the Superman pose or the Wonder Woman pose. Okay, and we've taught that to our children, particularly before they're going for examinations, and it really helps. So how does the Superman, what is the Superman pose? Anyone? Do you know what the Superman pose is? One arm is extended and one arm is here, right? Yay! Good on you, Raj. Yeah, good on you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing the Superman pose. So that is the Superman pose. So before you go for a conversation or before you start something, try that Superman pose. Stand in front of the mirror, put your one hand on the hip, one arm extended outside, and say, I am a Superman. Or you could do a Wonder Woman pose. I am a Wonder Woman. Okay? But do that and say it to yourself. The reason is there are a couple of things that are happening to your body and in your body when you're doing that. One is when you do that, you straighten up your spine and you take away the weight and the stress from your shoulders and your neck. The second thing that happens is your lungs expand. So you get a little bit more of oxygen. And what that does is it helps your brain, it helps your prefrontal cortex in making a decision that is balanced. The third thing is that your tongue is actually influencing, your words are influencing your brain and creating new neural pathways that you're super and that you can do it. So that's the very first thing. So whenever you come across a situation which needs a little more grit, a little more resilience, and if you don't have a mirror, you can say it in your head and just see what happens somatically in your body. When you talk about somatics, it's about what happens in each cell of your body. So try that strategy. It's very easy. It's very simple to do. And kids love doing it, especially if they're the younger ones. They love doing it. I'm a superman. I'm a superboy. I'm a supergirl. So have a think about how that can affect. That is one part of it. You can extend it. When we talk about cultivation, you can play a game with your children. So we're going to try and play a game now. Okay? Now you are a superman or a superwoman or a supergirl. You're a superhuman. And I want you to try this and put it in the chat box. Because you're a superhuman, you have a super gaze. Whatever your eyes fall on, look around you. Whatever you can see around you, it becomes supercharged. Okay? It's a game. Play along. Imagine. Let your absolute imagination run wild. So today, my gaze falls upon my glasses. Whatever I see with my glasses will be supercharged today. My gaze falls upon my pen. Whatever I write with this pen today would be the best, the most super words that come out of my pen today. So play along, take a look at something around you and put it in the chat box. What is something super that you're doing? It's a super gaze. Come on, we're going to give you 2 minutes to put it in the chat box. What is super around you? Go on. Beautiful, Raj. So every time you drink from that glass, you're going to be supercharged today. What else can you see around you? Oh, Daniel, that is so beautiful. Listening to my wife's voice on a call, but I love her voice. It charges my day. How beautiful. Glasses and your child, hugs from your children, and it'll supercharge you. Big part of raising resilient kids. And it's going to give you the superpower and the super knowledge of how to raise resilient kids and share it with others. Thank you. And you know what you can do? When you're sitting with your children, you can ask them to look around them and say, if your gaze falls onto something, how is it going to make it super? You can play that further because the more imagination you bring, the more playfulness you bring to your conversations, the easier it will happen, the more easier it is to build new neural pathways. The intention of this is to stop focusing on something that is very, very serious. The pandemic is serious, the HPL is serious, the going out restrictions are serious, but you want to build new neural pathways and not just continue to focus on these things. So the minute you look around, the minute you start focusing on different things, you distract your brain. So these are some of the strategies which are very simple and some of the things that you can start doing to cultivate that practice. And for us, it is really important that we cultivate these things when things are going okay. So that, unfortunately, when things do not go well, these are the things that will pull you back and that will develop resilience as a family. All right? So I'm going to hand back to Matt. So remember to play, laugh, and live.
Thank you, Atima. Beautiful little contemplative break there. We're going to jump into the second part of our session, and hopefully you can see the threads coming between all this different content, whether it's last week's session on self-care and realizing that parents need to look after themselves. We all do first in order to parent from a position of abundance. It's important to play and have fun, but also at the same time, like Atima said, we want to raise strong children, not repair them when they're broken necessarily. We want to get in early and develop practices that we know are sustainable as they go throughout their childhood. So the second part is grit, which I find is a really, really interesting one because it's not just about working really hard and persevering. There's many different components to grit, but at the same time, there is a huge amount of research that talks about people who are successful don't give up. They're prepared to sweat, they're prepared to persevere, but they've also got a passion for something too. So there's some interesting research that I'll share with you as well. One aspect is that if our kids choose something that they're interested in, whether it's I'm going to write a new recipe, I'm going to take up drumming, then the most important part is that we teach them to finish what they started, to get to the end and conclude and reflect. That's really important. Otherwise, we're developing patterns of just giving up every time something becomes difficult, or they receive feedback that isn't less than perfect. So some of these ideas, again, aren't mine. I've stolen them from some really good authors. Angela Duckworth, if you're interested, does a really good TED Talk on grit, and she was a teacher and a psychologist. Dan Goleman really popularized emotional intelligence about 20 years ago. And the marshmallow test research comes from Walter Mischel a long, long time ago about developing self-control and grit in children from as young as 2 and 3. So grit from Angela Duckworth's perspective talks about passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And so this is an interesting distinction from just working hard and not giving up. The idea is that it's about working hard and not giving up for a purpose and a long-term goal. So she talked about athletes and musicians and world leaders who actually had in their minds that they're going to be something. And over a period of 3, 4, 5 years, they work towards that. This doesn't just have to be academic outcomes or global success. It can be things like in your family, you want to develop grateful children. And so as a family, you set that as a long-term goal and that you don't deviate from that over a period of time. So you bring in gratitude practices, you talk about appreciation, you make cards for each other, and you make that the fabric of your family. So grit in this context is passion and perseverance for long-term goals. It's made up of many different components from a research perspective, and we won't have time to go into all of them today. One interesting part is that for our learners and for our kids, it's important that, for one, grit isn't imposed on them. It's something that we want to develop in them as they're working towards a goal that means something to them. So an interesting one for me is I grew up in Melbourne. I was an AFL boy very, very early on, loved Aussie rules football, and our eldest had no interest at all. He just wanted to play this game called soccer, which the ball was shaped wrong and it kept not working. And I was completely incompetent at coaching soccer. But I realized for him, that was his interest. And so it was a matter for me to step back and say, you know what? This matters to you. And so his grit and determination for soccer is far more than it ever would have been in some other sport. So there is an element that we want to give our kids a bit of agency here. So interest is important, smart practice is important, and optimism that they're working towards something is important too. And so obviously this is a lot to take in, and that's part of the reason we're recording it. But it's also realizing that grit is more than just head down, work really hard. There has to be a why sitting behind it as well. Interestingly enough, the research talks about being distracted by talent. And you've probably all gone through school where there was someone who was incredibly talented at something. And interestingly enough, when they did a longitudinal study and they looked at people who were really talented compared to people who were not as talented, but put in twice as much work on their effort and growth mindset, in the end, effort counted twice as much as raw talent alone. Whether this was from a sporting perspective or an academic perspective, effort essentially counts twice as much as talent. And you can argue this from many different perspectives, and that's good because we want you to wrestle with this. But the idea is that if you have a talented child, talent is not enough to define success. It's got to come with an element of rigor and effort. And again, to go back to a very poor Australian analogy, but I used to play football with a very, very, very talented young man, and he got drafted to the AFL, had no rigor and no effort, no care, just leveraged his talent. Within 6 months, he was dropped and was a bit rudderless because for his whole life, he'd just been told, you are so talented. And so as parents, it's a bit of a red flag too, to make sure that when we're giving feedback to our kids, it's not just, you are the most artistic person in the world. It's encouraging growth. I really love the way that you shaded those lines and added form. What's next? So that we're encouraging this hunger for growth rather than just defining them as being talented, therefore this will happen. And the other thing is that obviously as humans, we're socially influenced by each other for better and for worse. Our kids are influenced by their peers. And so group conformity is really interesting. When we talk about raising resilient kids, our family culture is important. And this is where as a parent, you're kind of like, oh, I was really hoping I could just handball this with a tool. The reality is our kids look to us. So if you are around gritty people, you become grittier. And so if we are modeling this in our family culture that, you know what, mum didn't give up today, dad didn't give up today, your cousin did this. And we have this language and this culture that, you know what, if we've got a goal that's worthwhile, we're all going to support you to get to it. It does influence each other and supports our kids to not give up when they have a setback. So Duckworth did some research around job retention, which is an important one in terms of predicting future success. Because if our kids eventually are changing jobs every 6 months, they're not getting stuck into the culture, they're not being able to innovate and succeed. And she was saying that no other personality trait that you can measure, including extroversion, emotional stability, and conscientiousness, was effective as grit at predicting job retention. And I know that we're not thinking necessarily what our kids are going to become, but as employers, Atima and I know that, and anyone who's working in HR, that you want your employees to come in with a fair bit of grit to say, you know what, I'm going to make this work. And when there is a hurdle or a challenge, that they work through that rather than just exit out when things get difficult. And she also said that we do have this natural bias and this hidden prejudice against people who've got there because it appears that they're just talented. And for those of you who have got talented kids, the provocation is to make sure that they don't rest on their laurels to say, well, I am this because I'm talented. No, they actually generally work hard. And when you look at successes in terms of music industry and other things, there are very few overnight successes. Generally, there's a backlog of hard work, failures, mistakes to go through it along the way. And the interesting thing is that grit tends to grow. So if you have an early years child, rest assured, it's not over yet. We're not expecting sustained practice from a 5 and 6 year old. That generally grit grows over time. And this piece is probably a little bit sidetracked, but I just find it interesting. So the research says at the moment that the grit grows the older that you get. There's no conclusive evidence to say whether it's a generational thing or it's a maturity thing. So the jury's kind of out at the moment. So if you measured grit scores, and I'll give you a chance at the end of the session to do your own grit score to see if you're gritty or you need to work on it. But the idea is that 25 to 30-year-olds at the moment are scoring lowest in this category. At the moment, our 65-year-olds and older are demonstrating the most amount of grit and resilience and perseverance. One argument is that it's a generational thing. Those who are 65 and older went through a different time when things possibly weren't as instantly accessible. They weren't used to just being on and validation, and they were used to working hard. Or the other element is that as we grow up, we realize that if we just keep giving up all the time, we don't get anywhere. So the jury's kind of out, but it's an interesting one to think that as parents, we want to grow this over time with our kids. And so what we expect of a 5-year-old is going to be different to a 15-year-old in terms of staying power and resilience in terms of grit. So that's the why. And we look at now at the how do we do this at home? How come as parents we do this? This one sounds like it's kind of counterintuitive, but creating frustration is a really good thing. And frustration is probably sometimes a negatively loaded word, but Rubik's Cube is a good way of doing this. When you see your child wrestling with something like this, for one, it's not an impossible task, but it is going to require a fair bit of perseverance to figure out how to solve it. In a school context, we call this pedagogical tension or the zone of proximal development, where we want to take the child from where they're at to the next step. And to do that, we have to create a bit of tension where they're not sure and they have to trial and error, they have to make mistakes. But it's that process that psychologists call flow, where they're just in it and they're wrestling with ideas. So from a parent perspective at home, creating a little bit of frustration is good. And if anything, when you hear frustration creeping in, you're like, yes, this is my teachable moment to swoop in as an amazing parent to talk about grit and not giving up because they've reached that frustration point. So as parents, we monitor and we reflect. So obviously it's not about always pushing through and never giving up, choosing your battles and thinking, okay, you know what, during HBL, my daughter's really wrestling with this maths problem. I think it's within her grasp. We're going to push through and work through this frustration together. We're going to look at our language, our self-explanatory style, and we're going to succeed and we're going to reflect on it at the end. So tension and frustration is okay. But again, we're talking about that Goldilocks principle where it's just right. It's not too much. And unfortunately, parents, this last one, this one is for all of us. We have to model it. And it's difficult you don't want to just get down to the dinner table and say, everyone, today I was gritty when I did this, 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 and this. No, that doesn't really work. But it's thinking about examples and sharing strategies. It might even be simple if you've got little kids of doing a puzzle together and not quitting until it's done. And then celebrating that feeling of, hey, we worked on this together. It can be starting something like a jogging club in your family, or practicing a sport or something together, cooking a recipe where you model not giving up when it goes wrong. If you want to be a little bit sneaky, you intentionally fail and then model how you resolve the failure, things like that. So you can have a bit of a fun with it, like a team has said, but it is important that if our kids are to see it, then we need to model it. Another strategy that you can take away, you can click on the link later to the Character Lab. This is Angela Duckworth's website. And she says that one thing that you can do as a parent, and for children who are in middle years and older, they can do this as well, is to choose a really big success that they're proud of. Perhaps it was making new friends, transitioning to Singapore, and write down all the things that you did well to make sure that was a success. Having that conversation, sharing them as a family, brings out a whole lot of inherent strategies that you're already doing and your kids are already using because they've been through so many successes as well. So feel free to click on that link later and have a look at the playbook around the stories we tell each other. And the last one for parents that proves to be really important for grit is goal setting. It sounds a little bit boring when you say, let's just set goals, but the idea is that it can be quite organic. Where are you headed next? What are you actually trying to achieve? Temptations that provide short-term gratification but impede people from long-term goals are ever abundant, thanks to convenience stores, online shopping, social media, streaming video, and other devices. And interestingly enough, I'm not a cynic here at all. I love using technology, but it's interesting to see that when our kids are able to jump between one thing and another thing, are they developing long-term goal setting, or are they even developing short-term and medium-term goal setting? So across dozens and dozens of studies, setting specific difficult goals has been shown to help people achieve higher performance compared to just saying, do your best. Off you go, I'm proud of you, do your best. That's important, but it's important to really set some goals. And again, these don't have to be world leader goals. They can be short-term measurable goals that you say, by the end of the term, as a family, we're gonna run one 3-kilometer run together. And then you celebrate it, you reflect, and you go to the next goal. And so if you want to add a little bit more spice to this flavor, then if you share these goals publicly, research says it's far more likely to happen. So again, as parents, if you have a chance in the upcoming break to set a goal as a family, own it as a parent to say, as a family, we're going to do this, this, and this. We're going to develop empathy. This is how we're going to do it. So there's a visibility and a publicness with the goals. If you really love goal setting and you want to go a little bit further with this, Angela Duckworth research talks about the biggest mistake we make with goals is that we either start really, really small. And for our health, for an adult, we might say, I'm gonna walk once a week and that's it. Or the big term goal, we go too high and we go, I'm gonna take over the world. I'm gonna be president. I'm gonna be the Singaporean prime minister. And we miss out this mid-level goal in between, which is kind of like 3 to 6 months away. And we measure that. So obviously our kids set big goals and you might have a budding soccer player or a world leader or a chef. And that's important. But if we just throw it up there and have no working way of getting there, then we don't get success along the way. So something to think about is when we're setting goals, it's a first step, a middle step towards an end goal. So if you're interested, I'll give you a chance to scan the QR code now. If not, we will post this with the slides and you can do it at a later date because I'm mindful of timing. But this is the grit scale from Angela Duckworth. It gives you a chance to do your own grit score. I think 4 is about the highest. If you get it wrong, don't worry, just do it again and make yourself feel a little bit better. No, if you get it wrong, have a look at, does this reflect you? How can you build a little bit more grit and determination for long-term goals into your family?